Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to join us this evening for the final talk of the year. You've braved the cold. Some of you have even torn yourself away from free wine. This is the dedication we admire in the Scott Club. You're quite right to come and join us because we have an excellent speaker this evening. One of the best events I attended this year was Helen's talk during the festival, where you presented your book, which you're going to speak on this evening. Helen Graham, his 5 times great uncle, was Charles Mackay, the subject of her book, The Real Mackay, Walter Scott's favourite comedian. Mackay was a renowned actor, perhaps most famous for his portrayal of Bailie Nicol Jarvie in Scott's Rob Roy. Weaving meticulous research together with imagination and creativity, Helen has produced a vivid and intriguing portrait of a fascinating figure, and we look forward to her lecture this evening. I should have started by saying, I am not Lucy. So you probably worked that out. Unfortunately, Lucy's a little bit under the weather just now and wasn't able to travel up from the borders this evening, so she sends her apologies to Helen and to you all. But it's my pleasure now to invite Helen up to give us our lecture for the evening. Thank you, Helen.
Good evening. And I'd like to start by thanking the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club for inviting me to talk to you this evening about this book that I've written telling the story of my 5 times great uncle, as you've just heard, comedian Charles Mackay, widely known as the Real Mackay, who was a friend of Walter Scott and arguably his favourite comedian. Before explaining why I came to think of him as Scott's favourite comedian, I'd like to tell you how I discovered he was my ancestor, how I came across the story of him being known as the Real Mackay, and why I decided to write a book about him. 10 years ago, when my mother's extensive family history research came into my possession, I felt duty-bound, out of respect to her diligence and her father's before her, to go through every letter, photograph, family tree chart, newspaper cutting, diary, and scribbled note. It was thoroughly overwhelming, but it gave me a real sense of my own Scottish heritage, having grown up in my father's village in Oxfordshire, hence the English accent. My mother's family, it transpired, are mostly from the Glasgow area and down into Dumfries and Galloway. The further back I delved, the more I could see she was almost completely Scottish. That was when I decided to compile some little volumes of family history that would include photos and charts and stories and anecdotes, which I could have printed up for my family members. It would be a nice way of sharing the treasures I'd inherited. During this thorough review of her archive, I came across a scrap of paper in her handwriting that really piqued my interest. This is it. Oh, sorry, this is it. Quite small. I find it fascinating the way something so small, so easy to overlook, can take your life in a whole new direction. What if it had been stuck between other pages and I had never seen it? My mother had scribbled the note when talking with my great aunt about my granny's granny, Euphemia Buchanan Mackay. And there we are. Good. Apparently Euphemia often talked about Charles Mackay with great pride. My mother's note says he was an actor, a friend of Walter Scott, and played the Bailie in the play Rob Roy. When he was off, his understudy played the part, and the audience shouted, "That's no the Real Mackay!" I was bowled over. Wouldn't it be amazing if we really had an ancestor who was a famous actor and friend of Walter Scott? I later discovered that the 1854 portrait we just saw by Sir Daniel McNee, which I've used on the front cover of the book, was bought from exhibition by Euphemia's father. So she had grown up with his portrait hanging on the wall of her home. No wonder she talked about him so much. She probably went to watch him perform in Glasgow's Theatre Royal as well. I decided to dig around and see if I could place Charles Mackay correctly in the family tree and verify it through birth records. After only a few weeks and some help from a distant cousin who's a brilliant genealogist, I not only found exactly where Charles Mackay fitted in our family tree and his birth record, but I also found another letter from a cousin of my mother's telling the same story about the understudy incident. More importantly, I then found a post on the Guardian's Semantic Enigmas thread from Aberfoyle historian Louis Stott, confirming the same story. Stott wrote, "The Real McCoy is an American corruption of the Real Mackay. One very possible origin of this phrase is connected with the stage version of Scott's famous novel Rob Roy. The part of Bailie Nicol Jarvie, a popular comic character, was played in Edinburgh for many years by an actor called Mackay. One evening he did not appear and was replaced by another actor. The memorable phrase, 'That's no the real Mackay,' was uttered sotto voce by a member of the audience. This use of the phrase originated in the 1820s, and it was undoubtedly this phrase which Robert Louis Stevenson had in mind when he described himself as the real Mackay. Shortly after these exciting discoveries, I came across a letter to the Scotsman in 1931 from a Mr. Robert Skinner, referring to another letter published 6 years earlier that was written by Charles Mackay's great-granddaughter, a householder in Merchiston. She also told the very same story. So I was convinced. I began reading about Sir Walter Scott too, and on my first visit to Abbotsford I was amazed to find this 1824 portrait of Charles Mackay by Sir William Allen hanging beside portraits of Scott's friends and family. This began a long and very fruitful correspondence with Kirsty Archer-Thompson, Abbotsford's award-winning curator, who had recently curated an exhibition containing information about Mackay and who has been very helpful with various aspects of my research throughout the past few years. This photo was taken in the summer when I went back to Abbotsford to give her a copy of the book, and the collections officer kindly took the portrait out of storage for me to photograph. So you can imagine, the more I discovered, the more I wondered why I'd never heard of Charles Mackay before, and why it wasn't common knowledge, in Scotland at least, that he had made the phrase, "the real Mackay," so famous during his 40-year career on the stage. Why had no one written a book about him? It began to dawn on me that I should probably have a go at writing a book myself, especially considering the family connection. This was an overwhelming thought for someone who wasn't a writer. My background is in knitwear design and filmmaking, with songwriting and family anecdotes being my main outlet for writing and storytelling before I embarked on this book. The idea that I could even make a small contribution towards reinstating the real Mackay as a national figure and acknowledging his huge contribution to Scottish theatre began to seem like something that would be worth attempting. It's been a long process involving writing courses, books on crafts of writing novels, tutorials, writing a completely different novel first to cut my teeth on novel writing, not caving in after reading bracing reports from editors, and beavering away at numerous rewrites, always fueled by an absolute determination to see it through, and a good deal of encouragement from family and friends. It took about 7 years to finish it, by the end of which I wondered if I might inadvertently have become the world expert on Charles Mackay. Although many theatrical historians mention him, describing incidents or aspects of his life, describing some of the many other roles he played, both comic and serious, and his significance in the emergence of a new kind of Scottish national drama, it seemed no one had yet put everything together to tell the story of his life. However, on this, I was proved to be wrong. After my manuscript had been signed off for publication, so it was too late to make any changes, I randomly saw a poster in Stockbridge's Bailie Bar for a play called The Bailie, written by the playwright, journalist and civil servant Donald Mackenzie in the 1960s, and performed by actor Callum Mill in Riddle's Court for 3 weeks during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe of 1970. The play was presented by the Scottish Actors Company. The set was designed by Hamish Henderson, and it was directed by Tom Fidelo. This seemed quite a significant bunch of people to me, so I thought I should try and find out more. I requested to view the script in the Special Collections Room of the National Library, and I was flabbergasted to discover It was a one-man play telling the story of Charles Mackay's life, as though he were in his dressing room before his final performance. It's all written in the Scots dialect. How Mackenzie discovered so much information about him without the benefit of the incredible resources now available on the internet, I don't know. He must have spent a lot of time in the library. As an aside, I should very much like to see this excellent play put on again, but in order to start the ball rolling, I need to find living relatives of Donald Mackenzie to gain their permission to use it. So if anybody knows how I can find them, please let me know. Mackenzie also wrote an excellent book called Scotland's First National Theatre, which again I only discovered after my own book was finished. In it, he writes a good deal about Mackay, but the one fascinating detail he picked up from some source I've yet to discover and would have loved to include in my book was that Mackay was always referred to as the Bailie and had his own particular group of cronies with whom he had a reputation as a narrator of bizarre stories. How I wish I could have heard some of those. I was absolutely thrilled to receive my first pre-publication review in March of this year from Sir Ian Torrance. Thank you, Ian. My good friend Sir Maxwell MacLeod was kind enough to ask Ian to read and review it for me, and his enthusiastic, encouraging words make the whole laborious process seem so very worthwhile. A quote from his kind review is published on the cover of my book. An utterly enthralling book, immensely successful, minutely researched, and very moving. Thank you, Ian. I couldn't have wished for a better commendation. I also quoted on the book a comment I came across in the writings of Joseph Todd Gordon MacLeod in 1976. He said, Mackay's creation of Bailie Nicol Jarvie established his reputation as the finest Scottish comedian of the 19th century. And that made me feel very proud of my uncle. People sometimes ask me why I decided to write the book as a biographical novel rather than a biography. I think it was because the idea of bringing Charles and various other characters to life really inspired me. Also, I wanted to make it accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Little did I know that by choosing this genre, I would be following in the footsteps of the Wizard of the North. A fortnight ago, my friend and fellow Scott enthusiast Alan Jack, who many of you know, I think, contacted me to say a copy of my book had been included in the Edinburgh Central Library's new display about Scottish writing. I was shocked, to say the least. Online, the introduction to it says, we have a new display in the cabinets in the Edinburgh and Scottish collection on Scottish writing. Pictured are some of the images and works on show that focus on the Scottish literary masterpieces, The Evergreen by Alan Ramsay, Red Gauntlet by Walter Scott, and the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner by James Hogg. These books are all celebrating important milestones this year. This display looks at how these three influential writers have inspired other writers today and how the reception of these works has changed over time. The notice by my book in the display says, historical fiction based on fact was a common treatise for Scott, and this novel explores Scott's favourite comic actor on the Edinburgh stage. I still can't quite believe it's in there. Well, I was flabbergasted. There are only 8 books by modern authors in this display, alongside these precious antiquarian books. The others are by eminent writers like Muriel Spark, Diana Gabaldon and Ian Rankin. I'm still pinching myself. Charles Mackay didn't set out to become a famous actor. When he was a volunteer in the Argyll militia during the Napoleonic Wars, he enjoyed singing, playing the fife and drum, and making people laugh with his impersonations. He was very popular in the officers' mess, and when an officer suggested he should put on an entertainment in town, they were billeted in Ayr at the time, he gave it a go. It was a disaster, and he almost gave up the whole idea of acting there and then. A few years later, though, when he left the militia after Waterloo, he became a full-time actor at the Theatre Royal in Ayr under Henry Erskine Johnson. He married an actress called Charlotte O'Keeffe in the company, and by the following year they moved north to join Corbett Ryder's Northern Circuit, Aberdeen, Perth, Dundee and so on. This was 1818, and the author of Waverley's book, Rob Roy, was first trialled on the stage. Ryder put on a production of Isaac Pocock's version in Perth, casting Mackay in the role of Bailie Nicol Jarvie. Little did Charles know it was the role that would define his career, a role he was to make his own and play well over 1,000 times. However, according to historian Donald Campbell in his book Playing for Scotland, the opportunity was nearly snatched from his hands. As a matter of fact, Campbell writes, Mackay very nearly did not play the Bailie, even in Perth. Although he had originally been assigned the role, another actor in the company demanded that Mackay give it up. This actor, Williams by name, had been acting leading comedy roles for some time and claimed seniority over Mackay. Ryder offered Mackay the role of Rashleigh, and when this was obstinately refused, there was an unholy row. I'll continue the story with a short extract from my book. Mr. Ryder, with respect, I must object. I've put a great deal of preparation into the character of the Bailie. I have a very strong affinity with him. In fact, I'm confident I can make him come alive better than anyone else in this company, and I'm simply not prepared to compromise. Charles folded his arms resolutely, and Mr. Ryder ran a hand through his scant brown hair, sighing. Suddenly, Mr. Williams grabbed Charles by the elbow and spun him round, shoving him in the chest with the flat of his hand and pushing his big florid face close to Charles's as he spat out the words, "How dare you, Mackay? The part should be mine and there's an end to it." Charlotte could hardly breathe. Her kerchief fell to the floor and she bit her lip, willing Charles to stand up for himself. "That's enough, Williams," Ryder boomed, pulling the men apart with surprising strength. "Neither of you shall be the Bailie. I shall scrap the whole thing. I never liked the play anyway. And now, with all this infernal jockeying for position, I want nothing more to do with it. I hope you're both satisfied." There was a shocked silence in the room. Mr. Ryder was usually such a self-possessed man. What on earth is the matter? Why the ominous silence and glum faces? What have I missed? Charlotte looked round to see Ryder's young wife, Jessie, coming through the door with a quizzical smile on her neat, pretty features, her two little daughters in tow. Hardly old enough to be a mother, Jessie was petite, with long dark hair worn in ringlets and the kind of bold self-assurance that fills a room. She was also a spirited actress and seemed to Charlotte quite determined and fearless. Jessie had married the newly widowed Ryder when she was only 15, and now at just 20 she had 4-year-old twins of her own and was stepmother to Ryder's 2 older children. She took her husband to one side for a few minutes, soothing him with her mellow voice and effortless charm, then turned towards the waiting actors to make an announcement. "I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear the disaster has been averted and the play will go ahead. Mr. Mackay will play the Bailie and I will play Diana." Then she turned to Mr. Williams and dismissed him with perfect confidence, wishing him all the best for his future endeavours as he stormed out of the room. In the November of that same year, 1818, Charles received a letter from William Murray, manager at the Edinburgh Theatre Royal, or received overtures, as one historian put it. Charles Mackay and his wife, Charlotte O'Keeffe, a relative of the well-known playwright John O'Keeffe, arrived at the Edinburgh Theatre Royal in December to join the stock company. Charles's first role, according to the theatrical chronicler James Dibdin, was as Mr. Russell in The Jealous Wife on December 26th. He went on to play several other roles during that winter, but it was when he stepped back into his role as Bailie Nicol Jarvie for Edinburgh's first production of Pocock's Rob Roy MacGregor, or Auld Lang Syne, on Monday, February the 15th, 1819, that he made such a success he was later credited with transforming the very fortunes of the theatre itself. William Murray extended the run to a record 41 days and repeated the play often in years to come, with Mackay in the lead comedy role. It never failed to fill the house and the coffers and to bring the roof down with applause, cheering and laughter. It was following his first electric performance in Edinburgh that Charles received a letter from a certain Jedediah Cleishbotham, who he probably knew to be Scott. I have had the great privilege of handling this letter in the Special Collections Room of the National Library. Such acknowledgement from one so influential, combined with his extraordinary and rather sudden popularity, created a turning point in Mackay's career from which he never looked back. I know you won't be able to read it, but I will read it to you. Friend Mackay, my lawful occasions having brought me from my residence at Gandercleugh to this great city, it was my lot to fall into company with certain friends, who impetrated from me a consent to behold the stage play which hath been framed forth of an history entitled Rob Roy, which history, although it existeth not in mine erudite work, entitled Tales of my Landlord, hath nathless a near relation in style and structure to those pleasant narrations. Wherefore, having surmounted those arguments whilk were founded upon the unseemliness of a personage in my place and profession, appearing in an open stage playhouse, and having buttoned the terminations of my cravat into my bosom in order to preserve mine incognito, and endued an outer coat over mine usual garments so that the hue thereof might not betray my calling, I did place myself, much elbowed by those who little knew whom they did incommode, in that place of the theatre called the 2 Shilling Gallery, and beheld the show with great delectation, even from the rising of the curtain to the fall thereof. Chiefly, my facetious friend, was I enamoured of the very lively representation of Bailie Nicol Jarvie, insomuch that I became desirous to communicate to thee my great admiration thereof, nothing doubting that it will give thee satisfaction to be apprised of the same. Yet further, in case thou shouldst be of that numerous class of persons who set less store by good words than good deeds, and understanding that there is assigned unto each stage player a special night called a benefit, it will do thee no harm to know that the phrase cometh from 2 Latin words, bene and facio, on which their friends and patrons show forth their benevolence. I now send thee mine in the form of a 5L web, £5, as a meet present for the Bailie, himself a weaver and the son of a worthy deacon of that craft. The which propine I send thee in token that it is my purpose, business and health permitting, to occupy the central place of the pit on the night of thy said beneficiary or benefit. Friend Mackay, from one whose profession it is to teach others, thou must excuse the freedom of a caution. I trust thou wilt remember that, as excellence in thine art cannot be attained without much labour, so neither can it be extended or even maintained without constant and unremitted exertion. And further, that the decorum of a performer's private character, and it gladdeth me to hear that thine is respectable, addeth not a little to the value of his public exertions. Finally, in respect, there is nothing perfect in this world, at least I have never received a wholly faultless version from the very best of my pupils. I pray thee not to let Rob Roy twirl thee around in the ecstasy of thy joy, in regard it oversteps the limit of nature, which otherwise thou so sedulously preservest in thine admirable national portraiture of Bailie Nicol Jarvie. I remain thy sincere friend and well-wisher, Jedediah Cleishbotham. What a character. It's unlikely that Scott sat in the central place of the pit for Charles's benefit night on May the 12th, but he was probably there in his box. I recently had the privilege to view some playbills I'd never seen before in a private collection, one of which was for this benefit, for which Mackay chose Guy Mannering rather than Rob Roy, allowing him to play one of his other popular comedy roles, Dominie Sampson. What was new to me, though, was that he also sang a song written for him to sing in character, called Bailie Nicol Jarvie's Journey to Aberfoyle. I included a scene about this in my book in the autumn of that year, But this playbill shows me Mackay had started performing it much earlier. And I was lucky enough to have a brilliant folk singer perform the song at my book launch in June. All of this leads me to my claim that Charles Mackay became Walter Scott's favourite comedian. I'd like to let the great man continue to speak for himself on this matter by reading a few more excerpts from his letters. The Theatre Royal in Edinburgh had been in dire straits financially for several years, and when the long run of Rob Roy finally came to an end in April 1819, Scott wrote to his friend Daniel Terry about the extraordinary turnaround that had happened in the theatre's fortunes. Would to heaven these sheets could do for you what Rob Roy has done for Murray. He has absolutely netted upwards of £3,000. To be sure, the man who played the Bailie made a piece of acting equal to whatever has been seen in the profession. For my own part, I was actually electrified by the truth, spirit and humour which he threw into the part. It was the living Nicol Jarvie, conceited, pragmatical, cautious, generous, proud of his connection with Rob Roy, frightened of him at the same time, and yet extremely desirous to interfere with him as an advisor. The tone in which he seemed to give him up for a lost man after having provoked him into some outburst of Highland violence. Ah, Rab, was quite inimitable. I do assure you I never saw a thing better played. 2 years later, Mackay was invited to perform in a production of Rob Roy in Covent Garden, and Scott wrote several letters to his friends to drum up support for his fellow Scot. I particularly liked the way he emphasised Mackay's private worth as a man of integrity in his letters, who I understand is very respectable in private life. I am told he is a deserving sort of person. The man, I am told, is perfectly respectable in his life and habits, and consequently deserves encouragement in every way. Scott wrote effusively to playwright Joanna Baillie and to the poet Samuel Rogers, but it is his letter to Lord Montague I should like to quote here. My dear Lord, there is a man going up from Edinburgh to play one night at Covent Garden, whom, as having the very unusual power of presenting on the stage a complete Scotsman, I am very desirous you should see. He plays Bailie Nicol Jarvie in Rob Roy, but with a degree of national truth and understanding which makes the part equal to anything I have ever seen on the stage, and I have seen all the best comedians for these 40 years. I wish much, if you continue in town till he comes up, that you would get into some private box and take a look of him. Sincerely, it is a real treat. The English will not enjoy it, for it is not broad enough, or sufficiently caricatured for their apprehensions, but to a Scot it is inimitable, and you have the Glasgow Bailie before you, with all his bustling conceit and importance, his real benevolence, and his irritable habits. Scott mentioned in his letters that Charles Mackay had been engaged for one night only, but in fact he was so popular in Covent Garden that his stay was extended. Then Drury Lane also invited him to tread their boards, and even offered him a contract if he'd moved to London and join the company. But Charles refused the offer and returned to his wife and son in his beloved Edinburgh, where he'd been born and raised, an Edinburgh gutter blood, as he himself was known to say. King George IV's visit to Edinburgh has been well documented, and the 200th anniversary of that visit was celebrated in various ways 2 years ago. I found it fascinating to read about the involvement of the Theatre Royal in those celebrations, in a detailed account of the King's visit, which was written by Robert Moody just 2 months later in October 1822. I particularly enjoyed reading about the King's reactions to the play, Rob Roy, which he had requested. Especially enjoyed reading his comment about Mackay. On his way home, the King laughed very much in his carriage at the wit of the Bailie, and observed that the play was neither too long nor too short, and that he was quite delighted with it. Mackay was, by 1824, without a doubt, still the main attraction at the Edinburgh Theatre Royal, which was enjoying something of a revival, a golden era of national drama, under the management of sister and brother Harriet Siddons and William Murray, who regularly put on plays adapted from Sir Walter Scott's Waverley novels. When Murray decided to put on a production of St. Ronan's Well for his own benefit that summer, The fact that the lead comedy role was that of a woman did not put him off. He and Scott cooked up the idea of asking Charles Mackay to play the role as if he really was a woman, and he took the challenge. He even presented the address at the end of the play in that character, an address written by Scott specifically for Charles to give as Meg Dodds. This was not only unusual because he was a man acting a woman, but because it was normal procedure for the person whose benefit it was to give the address. Murray did appear on the stage at the end, though, in a comedy role as a rascally boy. This is how I brought the scene to life in my book. When the applause faded, Charles left a respectful pause. Then he ran onto the stage, still dressed as Meg, with several boys chasing and tormenting him, including Murray, who was dressed as a boy and acting the part with gusto. The audience began to titter again. A town officer came to chase them, and Charles turned to face the crowds, smoothing his apron and adjusting his frilly mutch, bringing his breathing under control and looking for their sympathy. Gesturing towards Murray, he suggested the officer should lend John McClay a whack, which brought gales of laughter at once. Then, hands on hips and lips pursed, he ranted on in rhyme about the Edinburgh bairns and bemoaned the recent changes that had come to Edinburgh. Sir Walter had inserted a dig at himself and his cronies about the controversial demolition of the old Buttertron, which had been pulled down to tidy up the High Street for the King's recent visit. Charles had assumed the identity of Meg so completely by this time, he felt as though he was just having a grand old gossip and moan with his customers. He delivered the rest of the address to shouts of agreement. The compliments for William Murray and his sister at the end of the piece brought the audience to their feet, and the applause was deafening. When Charles left the stage, Charlotte was there in the wings. She caught him in her arms and kissed him all over his face until he had to beg for mercy. They stumbled back into the green room together, laughing and breathless, to be greeted by the rest of the company with great enthusiasm and hearty slaps on the back. Another triumph, Mackay, bravo! What a marvellous woman you make, old man. I would never have guessed. That tops it all, I think, Charles. Well done indeed, sir. Thank you, Mackay, you did a magnificent job, as I knew you would. I have a feeling the coffers will be full tonight. Murray put a proprietorial arm round Charles's shoulders and steered him out of the earshot of the others. Sir Walter was here tonight, of course. He sent me a message saying how well he thought the play had gone. He said he thought you had kept your gestures far more within the verge of female decorum than he had expected. Quite a compliment coming from the Wizard of the North himself, eh, Charles? Charles smiled and nodded. He could think of nothing to say. He was utterly drained, completely thrilled, exhausted and exhilarated, inspired and overwhelmed. It would be a long time before he could join Charlotte at home. There was still the second half of the programme to endure. Then he would be expected to go to join Murray and the others for a wee toddy at the Shakespeare, no doubt. He hoped she'd still be awake when he finally collapsed into bed. If not, he might just have to wake her. One of the outcomes of the turnaround in the Theatre Royal's fortunes back in 1819 had been Harriet Siddon's establishment of a benefit fund for actors, based on Garrick's Theatrical Fund in London. In February 1827, a grand dinner was organised in the Assembly Rooms to raise funds for this worthy cause, and it was at this dinner that the recently widowed Sir Walter Scott was officially unveiled as the writer of Waverley. There are several accounts of the speeches that night, and Charles Mackay gave one near the beginning on behalf of the actors. He was by this time quite involved in running the Theatrical Fund himself. What particularly interests me about this event in the context of this talk is Scott's reaction to his unveiling. I'd like to read my own account of Scott's response, based very closely on records of the occasion. I painted Charles as a reluctant guest, as he had left his sick wife at home, knowing she was going to die soon. As the ovation showed no sign of abating, Scott rose to his feet and begged silence. His response was modest, measured, witty, and precise. I certainly did not think, in coming here today, that I should have the task of acknowledging, before 300 gentlemen, a secret which, considering that it was communicated to more than 20 people, has been remarkably well kept. Charles was deeply impressed by the composure of the man on what was probably his first foray into public society since his beloved Charlotte had died. He wondered if he would be able to find a fraction of that strength in himself when his own Charlotte was gone. The room was respectfully quiet as Scott's voice rang out, strong and true. The wand is now broken, and the book buried. You will allow me further to say, with Prospero, it is your breath that has filled my sails, and to crave one single toast in the capacity of the author of these novels. There was a profound moment of silence while the collective breath was held. I would fain dedicate a bumper to the health of one who has represented several of those characters of which I had endeavoured to give a skeleton, with a truth and liveliness for which I may well be grateful. I beg leave to propose the health of my friend Bailie Nicol Jarvie, and I am sure that when the author of Waverley and Rob Roy drinks to Nicol Jarvie, it will be received with the just applause to which that gentleman has always been accustomed. Nay, that you will take care that on the present occasion it shall be prodigious. Charles was stunned. The room erupted into gratifyingly prodigious and thunderous applause, and every eye turned towards him. He gathered himself and stood, fixing a wry and modest smile to his face, dipping his head in acknowledgement and preparing to assume the ridiculous voice of the pompous Bailie, as everyone expected him to. My conscience, he squeaked, and laughter erupted across the banquet hall. He waited a moment, then continued. My worthy father, the deacon, could never have believed that his son would hae sic a compliment paid to him by the great unknown. Quick as a flash, the King of Scottish society gave the perfect retort. The small known, now, Mr. Bailie. Applause rose to an even higher crescendo, and Charles looked across at his esteemed friend, catching his eye again. They were two grieving men, being lavished with praise and affirmation, the like of which most people would never dream of receiving. It was as though an unspoken agreement passed between them in that moment. They would both soldier on, beyond their sadness. They would continue to be the storytellers and entertainers they were born to be, and live out the rest of their lives in honour of those they had lost. Another letter that you can't read. Scott and Mackay remained friends and exchanged letters until Scott's illness took him to Malta in search of a cure in 1831, shortly before he died. Charles wrote to him a 3-page epistle, which is this, from Paris in January 1829, beginning by joking about the current Burke and Hare trial, saying, My conscience, Sir Walter, what's this in the good town of Edinburgh? And signing off by saying, Never think that I have forgotten for a moment the high respect and admiration due from your attached Nicol Jarvie. And Scott wrote to Mackay in 1830, apologising that he would not be able to attend Mackay's benefit, and that letter is in the archives of Georgia University now, and he kindly sent me a photo of it. Charles Mackay continued to play all the main comedy roles in the Theatre Royal after Scott's death and throughout the 1830s. He finished his contract there in 1841 and travelled throughout the 1840s, performing all his most famous characters and songs around the country and calling his solo show The Real Mackay. He died in 1857 after a stellar 40-year career, and in 1864 an obelisk was raised in his honour by his family and friends at his grave in the old Colton burial ground, where you can also see his name included in the list of celebrities buried there. I've described this scene in my next biographical novel, which can either be read as a sequel to The Real Mackay or as a standalone book, and which is due out in 2026. It's set in the second half of the 19th century and tells the story of the Real Mackay's granddaughter, who also became an actor and who lived a roller coaster of a life with more drama offstage than on. It's interesting to note as well that G. Mackay & Co. Limited, whisky distillers in Edinburgh, began to use a drop of the Real Mackay as an advertising slogan for its whisky in about 1870. This was based on the phrase "a drappie of the Real Mackay" included in a long poetic temperance tract published in Glasgow in 1857. It's probably due to the export of this whisky to America that the phrase travelled there, and was transformed into the Real Mackay, gathering many mythical stories about its origin along the way. Over the decades, between 1846 and 1882, 64 statues of characters from Sir Walter Scott's novels were added to the Scott Monument by various sculptors. I like to think the one of Bailie Nicol Jarvie might have been based on Charles Mackay. And this last photo was taken recently in the National Portrait Gallery's storage unit, Granton Arts Centre, when I took my book to show to my 5 times great uncle. It's probably full of little mistakes and wrong assumptions, but I like to think he might have given me one of his wry smiles and said, "Ni bad," if such a thing had been possible. Thank you.
Well, what a treat. That was absolutely excellent. I'm sure if you have questions, you'll be rushing to buy at the bargain price of £10 a copy of the book. We do have a few minutes left before our vote of thanks to ask questions just now as well. So are there any questions or comments? Eric?
More of a wee observation than a query, because I usually have questions and an auditor, but in this case, no. But I'm reading at the moment a book about the acting of Shakespeare, and the whole business is just with somebody called Beale, and really it's about the old serious business of comedy, because you can't have the tragedy without it as a co-distinction. But that you have brought to real life what's been taken for granted in the language is something really quite astonishing. It leaves me next door to a teetotaler. I might take a drap here. So we'll be subscribing to your attendant to your book without a doubt.
Thank you.
By the way, what is the title of your book to come, so we may look out?
Well, I haven't revealed that yet. You have to do these things in stages, you know. I've done the first draft, but anything can happen, and I'm holding back on that.
Well, thank you. Before I invite Sir Ian Torrance up to give the formal vote of thanks, I just want to thank you myself. I enjoyed your talk when I first heard it. I enjoyed reading the book even more. I think you managed to take what was both a personal story, a familial story, and make it relevant to so many other audiences, certainly to Walter Scott enthusiasts, but also to those who love the history of theatre, the Edinburgh of the period. You bring all of these things alive through your ancestor. I think he would have been very proud. You talked about Mackay bringing Bailie Nicol Jarvie alive. I think you brought Mackay alive. So not only is he pleased, I'm sure if he's looking down on that, but we are too. But for a more fulsome report, can I call on Professor Sir Ian Torrance to give the official vote of thanks? Thank you.
Helen, thank you for this beautifully constructed and very gentle and learned and utterly fascinating account of your 5 times great uncle. It's very moving. It's an amazing book. To give a little more context, Maxwell MacLeod, whom the son of Lord MacLeod of Funerary, whom a number of you would know, caught me in the club one day. His father and my father used to argue with each other. And Maxwell called me and said, would I write a book review for something he wanted to publish? And I said, yeah, okay. And he gave it to me. This was on a Wednesday. And then he said, actually, could I have the review on Friday? And, well, I said, yes, all right, I'll do that. And then I began to read the book. And the book really did enthrall me. It's, I think, a wonderful book. Now, why is it wonderful? or to me, this is speaking personally, because it took me into a new world. It did this so graphically and so effectively. It described the dramatists from his early days as a soldier, amusing other soldiers, doubtless all rather drunk, to becoming a player, to becoming part of a company. It described these extraordinary, vibrant, gifted people who depended on their ability to mimic, on their observation of mannerisms and manners of speech, accents, voice, and their ability to sing, and their ability to improvise. So these were not ordinary people. And then Helen goes on to describe the utterly fraught hand-to-mouth existence which these people lived. They never knew what was coming next. They turned their hand to anything. And she also described, actually very movingly, the miserable life which the women endured, along with some of them acting as well, some of them people of great ability. But it is actually an extraordinary, involving social history. Mackay was, I mean, he really, this really opened my eyes. He was made an honorary Doctor of Law by the University of Glasgow, and that's quite an accolade wherever you are. I think it's no secret to say that the person who owns the playbills is a good friend of many of us, Bill Sachs. And I spoke to Bill and said, you know, I've read this extraordinary book, and do you actually have any playbills? And Bill said, oh, come round, and he had about 40. So I introduced Helen to him, and of course, these are very illuminating. One thing which actually struck me, and Helen has really referred to this, was how these dramatizations by Pocock, by Daniel Terry, actually they came out 3 weeks after the novels were published. So the energy and the sheer creativity of this was astonishing. But when the dramas came out, they were often paired with the strangest companions in the theatre. So St. Ronan's Well in Edinburgh, 25th of November 1824, was paired with a farce called Animal Magnetism, and The Heart of Midlothian on the 4th of March 1820 was paired with a musical farce called Rosina. And it was this way of reading Scott to, as it were, a non-intellectual audience very often, but reading him through comedy, which was actually, I thought, fascinating. Thank you. I mean, this has really been an extraordinary, moving, fascinating account. And your research is so convincing and thorough, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And I really do recommend it, and I hope that others, because there are copies here, will read it and enjoy it too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I see that wine and canopies are awaiting us, so I'll keep my final comments brief. I just want to thank you all for your support of the clubs throughout this year. I think we've had a good range of speakers and good attendances throughout. Hopefully that will continue into 2025. We're just finalising the programme for the year ahead, and I can tell you it's a wonderfully diverse and rich range of speakers and subjects which we have. So hopefully we'll see you at future events. Just a reminder to try and encourage fellow members to come along and join you if you are coming. And if you know of anyone who isn't currently a member who you think may be interested, do please encourage them to come along. They do have the option, if they haven't been before, to come and try one for free. And I'm sure after that they'll be convinced that they want to become members. But keeping the membership healthy and lively is very helpful. One additional plea from me as the Secretary: I'll be sending out my newsletter with details both of the year that's passed and the year ahead. It does save the club considerable money if we're able to email newsletters rather than print and post. As you know, printing costs, postage costs are increasing all the time. Of course, if you do prefer a printed one, we'll continue to do that. If you're happy to switch to electronic, please check with me that we have your email address and we can use that as an alternative. I hope you all have a wonderful festive break. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. And thank you again for attending this evening for what was, I think, a really strong end to the year. Now we're on to the unofficial socialising of the evening. Thank you so much.